I'd like to introduce our next speaker. This is Dr. Decker, and I apologize, he and I were visiting because we both have a connection down at New Mexico State, and that's where he did his undergrad, and that's where I did my master's, and so we got to reminisce about some of the same people we know, and New Mexico State is a wonderful, wonderful place. And so, did you grow up in New Mexico? Or where?
Yeah, I did.
Where?
Four Corners area.
Four Corners. Oh, okay, totally different area then.
Yeah.
Night and day. And so it's great to have somebody from New Mexico, from the South. He earned his PhD at the University of Missouri in genetics, which is where I got my PhD, working under Dr. Jerry Taylor. That was fun, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yep.
And Jared is currently an assistant professor in the Division of Animal Science there at MU, and he's also the state beef genetics specialist. And he uses computational genetics to research cattle genetics, and that is a whole different field right there. So different field. So he's passionate about beef cattle genetics. He and I were visiting back there about genetics, about beef cattle genetics, and so I think you're going to enjoy his talk. Look forward to hearing and learning more about what you're doing up there.
Thanks. So feel free to interrupt me if you have questions or anything like that. Let's see. No, this isn't.
It's not really working. We're just pretending we have technology today. Just kidding, we don't have it.
Okay.
You just have to do old school and hit the button.
Okay.
Or I can sit there and you can nod.
I can. Well, now. Oh, there we go.
Ooh,
Okay. So.
that's fun.
I think everybody is familiar with this game, right? You get the little claw, you go in, you try to get a stuffed animal or some other toy, and basically never get one, right? You're just throwing your money away. I've played this game maybe once in my life because I don't enjoy throwing my money away, right? And so today, when we talk about DNA testing, hopefully I'll convince you that you won't be throwing your money away. But we need to make sure that if you are going to use this DNA technology, that you're doing it in such a way that you will see that return on investment. So we'll answer any questions you have about that and discuss that. So as was said when I was introduced, I grew up in northwest New Mexico, and then now here in Missouri I have a little hobby farm. But in my extension program, what I try to do is make sure that I'm describing these new genomic technologies, these new DNA technologies, doing it in a way that you all as farmers and ranchers can understand, but even more importantly, identify ways that you can use it on your farm and ranch to be more profitable. In my research program, basically we try to look at the history of cattle to better understand the genetics of cattle, and also try to create genomic predictions, DNA tests, that are more accurate and at a lower cost. Okay, so let's talk about selecting animals. Let's talk about the decisions we make of which heifers to keep, which bull to use. Okay, so for thousands of years, we've used phenotypic selection, and it works. Okay. But it's not the best, and let's talk about why. Let's consider that we have these two bulls up here, and I think most cattlemen, if they were both raised in the same environment with lush grass, maybe out in the sandhills or something like that, we would probably prefer the bull on the right because he's easier fleshing, he's more muscular, there's more pounds of product there, all of these things. But if these bulls were raised in two separate environments, now are those differences due to genetic differences, or are those differences due to their different environments, right? If that bull on the left is out there in the southwest, where he's having to cover miles and miles to find a little clump of grass to eat, we would probably expect him to look like that, right? We would expect him to not have as much fat cover, not have as much flesh. And so when we make selection decisions based on the phenotype, we're not taking any of the environmental factors out of the equation. Those environmental factors are still in the equation. And if you go to a bull sale and bring that bull home, you buy his genetics and you bring his genetics home. You're not bringing his environment home. You can't buy the environment. And so when you're making those selection decisions, you got to keep in mind that you are buying the genetics and your decision needs to be based on the genetics. The other problem with this phenotypic selection is it's got a roof, it's got a ceiling on how accurate it can be. Okay? When we're using EPDs or other genetic selection tools, we can get up to 100% accuracy in terms of our selection decision. With phenotypic selection, as accurate as we can ever get is the heritability of the trait. The heritability of the trait is the proportion of the trait that's due to genetic differences. Okay? So a trait like growth, say mature size, about 60% of that variation is going to be due to genetic differences. Okay? For a trait like fertility, the differences due to genetics might only be 15% of the variation. So let's talk about what an EPD actually is. An EPD stands for expected progeny difference. That word expected is actually a pretty loaded word. There's a lot of meaning there in that word expected. What we're talking about is a prediction of the future. And we're talking about the average performance or the mean performance. Okay? The P is for progeny. That EPD is for the progeny of the animal. That EPD is not a prediction of the animal's own performance. It's a prediction about how that animal's progeny, his calves, are going to perform. And then the D is for difference. And so with that difference, we're comparing animals, or we're comparing an animal to a breed average. Okay? So when we have EPDs, we're always making some sort of comparison looking at that difference. One of the things that I do in my extension program is I interact with people online a lot. And so you all sitting here, you're probably not going to be real harsh with me just because of in-person politeness. But if you get people online, they'll tell you exactly what they're thinking. Okay? And interacting with those people online, there is a lot of mistrust and uncertainty about EPDs. A lot of people think that it's hocus pocus, monkey business, just made up numbers. It's really not. And the key piece of information that allows EPDs to do what they do is measuring the relatedness between all of the animals in our data set. So the pedigree information that we use in EPD calculation, that's the key that drives the whole thing. Okay? The pedigree information that allows us to estimate how related the animals in our data set are allows us to take the total variation we see in the trait and split it up into genetic variation and other non-genetic factors like environment. Okay? So when we have that pedigree information, we know how similar we should expect these animals to be genetically. When we know that, then that allows us to separate that trait variation into genetics and into environment and other factors. So that's the whole thing that drives the bus of EPDs, and it's really that simple. There's no monkey business, there's no craziness going on there. Let's talk for just a second about how we actually use EPDs in practice. Okay? So I told you that EPDs are not a prediction of the animal's own performance, but a prediction of that animal's progeny performance. And so we've got the we've got the black bull up here. He's got a weaning weight EPD. So he's got a weaning weight EPD of 50 pounds. The gold bull, weaning weight EPD of 70 pounds. So there's a 20-pound difference in the EPD of these two bulls. Now we're going to take this bull, and we're going to breed them to a set of cows that are both in the same environment. So we're going to breed the black bull to 100 cows, we're going to breed the gold bull to 100 cows, and produce a bunch of calves, okay? The average in this example of these calves from the black bull is 495 pounds. That EPD difference of 20 pounds tells us that the gold bull's calves are going to weigh 20 pounds heavier. And so when we actually go and do this in the real world, this is what actually we see happen. And so the black bull's average is here at 495. The gold bull's average is here at 515. There's this 20-pound difference. But I think one of the ways that we sometimes get concerned with EPDs is the spread of these progeny. So there's going to be black bull's progeny that outperform the average of the gold bulls. And there's going to be gold bull progeny that underperform the average of the black bull. Okay? So when you go and you buy that semen on that Cavingese bull, just by chance, you might end up with a heavy calf, right? That's the randomness of genetics. It's not unexpected. It's what we know happens based on the principles of genetics. Okay, so why they wanted me to come talk here today is that the genetic technology that we use in the beef industry has changed drastically. So for various technologies, we see this hype cycle occur. We have a new technology come along, it's really hyped up, it fails to live up to those expectations, so we're down here in the trough of disillusionment. We have further research and development go on, and then it gets used productively by society. We've seen this same pattern with DNA in cattle. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, we had these gene tests coming on, right? You all remember the names. I won't mention them here today. But they were really hyped up and a lot of marketing to try to get that technology out in the industry. The question that academics like myself had at the time is, are these DNA tests actually delivering value to the industry? And the answer to those early tests was a pretty resounding no, okay? So if you were buying DNA tests in the late 90s, 2000s, unfortunately you didn't get your money's worth, okay? Those early DNA tests typically failed validation studies that were conducted, and the thoughts and assumptions that went into designing those tests were faulty. But in 2008, the University of Missouri was part of a team that developed a new product that we call a SNP chip. So Missouri didn't develop SNP chips, but they developed a SNP chip that was specific to cattle. And so now with a SNP chip, instead of looking at one or two genes, we can now take the entire DNA of the animal into account. And so we had genomic enhanced EPDs implemented by the Angus Association in 2010. In 2012, we had several other breed associations follow suit, and we've continued to see that happen. So in 2008, we had this major shift in how we were using DNA technology. So instead of looking at one or two genes or three genes, with genomic prediction, we take all 20,000 genes into account. Okay, so we take all of the genes of cattle into account in these predictions. And the other thing that happened is, because now instead of this DNA test being this standalone product, we were combining it with traditional EPDs, this validation step became central to the process, right? So we created the test, and then the very next step we took was to validate it. Whereas before it might be years before we actually had a validation study completed. And so now we train the genomic prediction, we validate it, and then we start to use it. So these early genomic predictions in the beef industry were what we call two-step genomic predictions. And so what we do here is we gather up thousands of cattle that we have both DNA information on and that we have the trait information on. and then we train this genomic prediction. In that training process, we estimate the effect of those 50,000 DNA variants. And so here I've drawn the cartoon, and this blue chromosome is the chromosome this bull inherited from his sire. The pink chromosome is the one he inherited from his dam. And we've got all of these DNA markers spread out along the chromosomes. So in the training step, what we do is we estimate the effect of all of these different DNA markers. Then we go and test this bull, and we find that at position 1, he has an A and a B genotype, okay? And we trained that effect of the A allele, the A variant, to be 0.1. The effect of the B allele is a negative 0.1. And so we do that for all of the variants. We test this bull. To come up with his genomic prediction is the sum of those 50,000 DNA effects. So if we add up all of these numbers, we get to 2.2, and so that's the bull's molecular breeding value. That's the bull's genomic prediction. So that's traditionally how we've used genomics in the beef industry. At the beginning, I told you the key to doing a DNA calculation was estimating the relatedness of our samples in our data set. We typically have done that with pedigree data. We can now estimate the relatedness with genomic data. And so this is two-step. When we estimate the relatedness with genomic data, we call that single step or one step, okay? And so some of the breed associations are in the process of switching from two-step to one-step. And so the only difference with one step is we're using the DNA information to estimate the relatedness of our samples. Let's talk about some of the available genomic technologies. So about a dozen of the breed associations have genomic enhanced EPDs. That means that a seed stock producer raises a set of bull calves, they collect a DNA sample from those bull calves, send it into the breed association. The breed association has that animal DNA tested. That DNA test information is then combined into the traditional EPD. And we'll talk a little bit later about the benefits of those genomic enhanced EPDs. And so when you open up an AI catalog or a bull sale, you can look for these logos, and these logos will tell you that that animal has been DNA tested. One of the really interesting things that we've also seen happen in the last couple of years is we've now used this genomic prediction technology, this DNA technology, to produce EPDs, basically, to produce estimates of genetic merit for commercial heifers, okay? So these are heifers that we don't know any of their pedigree. They're not registered. They're just typical commercial heifers. But using the DNA information, we can now estimate their genetic merit. So Zoetis has a couple of different products. The first two that we'll talk about are Angus specific. So these are for kind of straight bred Angus cattle that have at least 75% Angus ancestry. The first one that they released was called GeneMax Focus. It sells for about $17 the last time I looked. And you get two traits with GeneMax Focus. You get average daily gain and you get marbling. And then those two numbers are combined into an economic selection index, okay? Whenever possible, try to make your selection decisions based on an economic selection index. The reason I tell you that is an economic selection index maximizes the trait of profitability, okay? We talk about what trait should we be focusing on. The trait we really should be focusing on is profitability, and so an economic selection index allows us to do that. That index score is going to be from 1 to 99. 50 is going to be an average calf. 99 is going to be cream of the crop. 1 is going to be bottom of the barrel. Continuing to work with the Angus Association, Zoetis released another test that we call GeneMax Advantage. Now with this, you get genetic predictions for 17 different traits, and then those 17 different traits are combined into 3 different indexes: a cow advantage index, a feeder advantage index, and an overall index. Those indexes do exactly what they sound like they do. That cow index is from birth to weaning, and with a focus on maternal traits. That feeder index is from weaning to slaughter, with a focus on those carcass and feeder traits. And then the overall index is going to be from conception to slaughter. Okay, that test is going to run you about $39, and it has the same 1 to 99 ranking. So you're going to notice here that I'm going to talk about these breed-specific tests first, and we'll talk about why that is a little bit later. The other test that has been released is Maternal Edge. This is by the Gelbvieh Association, so it's for those Balancer and Gelbvieh commercial females. This is going to cost you $26. You're going to get reports for calving ease, maternal calving ease, weaning weight, yield grade, marbling, and carcass weight. And you're going to get this on a 1 to 10 scale. Okay, so a 1 is going to be bottom of the barrel, 10 is going to be cream of the crop, and 5 is going to be average. Herd Navigator by Red Angus is probably one of my favorite tests. If I own some commercial Red Angus animals, this is the test I would be using. Because the really cool thing here is you pay $25 and you get the full suite of Red Angus EPDs and indexes. That's pretty cool in my book for those commercial Red Angus animals to get that full suite of EPDs. So there you have access to that Herd Builder Index and the Grid Master Index. One thing to keep in mind is for this Herd Navigator test, 1 is going to be cream of the crop, 99 is going to be bottom of the barrel, and 50 is going to be average. Over here in St. Joe, we now have Method Genetics. They have 2 products called Method Choice and Method Prime. Method Choice is going to be $32. Method Prime is going to be $45. And they give you reports for a suite of different traits. And they also combine them into these different economic indexes. So now the next couple of tests are designed to try to work in crossbred cattle. Okay, so these are no longer breed specific. We have Identity Gold, which gives you predictions for several different traits. It's going to be reported on a 1 to 10 scale, with 1 being bottom, 10 being better, and it's going to cost you $40. The Identity Silver is going to give you is going to give you less traits, same scale, now $25. Another Zoetis product, PredictGen, is going to give you basically carcass traits. You can do, with most of these DNA tests, you can do the parentage verification as well. And this one is going to cost you $19.50. So, if you're going to use DNA testing in your herd, make sure you use the right test. Don't just use the test that the salesman says you should use. Make sure you understand the test and are using the test that fits your herd. So if you are producing registered cattle, do not use one of these commercial heifer tests. Buy the test from the breed association to get the genomic enhanced EPDs. If you're buying bulls, buy a bull with genomic enhanced EPDs. If you're testing commercial straight bred cattle from Angus, Red Angus, Gelbvieh, use those breed specific tests. They're going to give you the most bang for your buck. That breed specific testing right now with the current state of genomic prediction is going to outperform a multiple breed crossbred test. the other thing that I should mention here is make sure you are using the test that matches your marketing scenario. If you're selling calves at weaning, you need to use a test with some maternal focus in it, okay? But if you're retaining ownership and really seeing premiums for those cattle that do well on the grid, then you can use one of those tests that are more geared towards the carcass and the feedlot performance. So when you're talking to a breed rep or a salesman or whoever it is, you need to be asking a lot of questions. And one of the questions you should be trying to do is you need to have your BS filter on. And is this test going to actually do what they're saying it's going to do? Okay. So one of the questions you should be asking is how many DNA markers are actually included in the test. So if we're looking at a really simple trait like horns or polled, we can do that with a single DNA marker, okay? If we're talking about a genetic defect, we can do that with a single DNA marker. If we're talking about these more complex traits, these more quantitative traits that we typically use in the beef industry, if we have less than 100 markers, our ability to do a prediction is going to be pretty close to zero. Okay, so if somebody is telling you that they can predict a complex trait like marbling or growth or fertility or something like that, or disease resistance with less than 100 markers, I would say be very concerned about the validity of their claims. The other thing that you need to think about and ask them is what breeds were used in the design and the validation of this test. Okay, if the breed you're using, if you're using South Devon, if South Devon weren't used in the design of that DNA test, it's probably not going to be very useful for your herd. But if you're using Angus, and Angus was used to design and validate the test, then that test is probably going to work pretty well in your herd. So one of the big shortcomings of genomic prediction is if we train in one breed and validate and use in that same breed, it works really well. If we try to train in one breed and use and validate in a second breed, it doesn't work. It strikes out. It just doesn't perform very well. If we train in both of these breeds and try to use it in both of the breeds and crosses of those breeds, it works slightly worse than or about equal to a breed-specific genomic prediction. Okay? One of the questions you should ask is how much of the genetic variation is this test actually explaining? Okay? And obviously the answer here is going to be the more the better, okay? And they might not want to tell you the exact number, but you should try to get some handle of what ballpark of the variation in the trait they're actually explaining. To give you a little context to this, the Angus Association we talked about was kind of the first to implement genomic prediction in the beef industry. When they did that in 2010, they had a little over 2,000 animals that they used for the training of those genomic enhanced EPDs. And then they retrained in 2012 with 11,000 animals, 2013 with 36,000 animals, almost 37,000 animals, 2014 a little less than 60,000 animals, and then in 2016, they retrained with about 106,000 animals, okay? So up here, their training set is quite large now, okay? When they went from those 60,000 animals in September of 2014 to those 100,000 animals in April of 2016, they saw a little bit of improvement in various traits. They saw a big improvement in heifer pregnancy. That wasn't due to any improvement of the genomic side of things. That was because they finally got producers to start turning in more heifer pregnancy data. So even with genomics, that data that a seed stock producer turns into the breed association becomes even more valuable. Okay? But with 100,000 animals, they're explaining somewhere between 14% to upwards of about 65% of the variation in these various traits. Okay? So if you have somebody come to you and say they're explaining 70% of the variation in the trait, they better have hundreds of thousands of animals in their training population. And if they're telling you they're explaining 70% of the variation and they're training in 5,000 animals, that BS filter needs to go off again. The other thing is ask questions, find somebody else to ask. You can ask your regional livestock specialist, you can ask a member of a breed association staff, you can contact me. There's my phone number, my email address. I'm easy to find online. If you just Google Jared Decker, or if you Google steak genomics, steak like you eat, you'll find my website and be able to find me. So if you have a question about this stuff, feel free to give me a call. Okay? If you've had a visit from the sales rep and you've got some questions and maybe you feel like your questions didn't get answered, feel free to call me and we'll talk. Now here's the pitch as an extension specialist that I'm going to make to you, is that this genomics is actually delivering value to you as a beef producer. Here is the drop-dead easiest way to implement genomics in your herd. And it's quite simple. Buy bulls with genomic predictions. Okay? When you go to a bull sale, so let's say there's 2 bull sales the same day. And you open up the catalog, and one of the bull sales has a bunch of bulls that have genomic enhanced EPDs. The other bull sale has no bulls that have been DNA tested. I can tell you where I'm going that day. I'm going to the sale with the genomic tested bulls. Why is that? Why am I being so forceful about making that point? The genomic testing increases the reliability of those EPDs. So those EPDs that are produced for those yearling bulls with genomic test are going to be more accurate, more reliable than a traditional EPD. Those genomic testing, it can identify those genetic differences between full siblings. So several of you probably have brothers and sisters, and we all know that you all are the most attractive, smartest of your siblings, right? We all know that. And so we recognize that there's differences between full siblings, right? We see those same genetic differences between cattle that are full siblings. The DNA testing allows us to pinpoint those differences between those full siblings. Previously, when we just had pedigree data, if we had a set of ET fleshmate bulls, they all had the same EPD profile in the sale book on sale day. And it wasn't until we started getting progeny out of those bulls that we started to identify the differences between those full siblings. DNA testing allows us to do that day one when those ET fleshmates are born. The DNA testing gives you the same amount of information as if we had 10 to 20 progeny out of that bull. So it's simply more data on the bull earlier in its life. And what this ultimately means is it reduces your risk as a buyer. The way that I like to think about this is trying to go find a calving ease bull. Okay, so we go to that bull, we look at the bull's calving ease direct EPDs, and if they are parent averages, we don't have a lot of reliability or confidence in those estimates, just because we don't have enough data behind them yet. Okay, it's not a problem with how we calculate EPDs, it's a problem of a lack of data. Okay, So we take one of those bulls home, we breed them to our heifers, and then the next spring or the next fall, we're out there pulling calves at midnight. None of us want to take that risk of paying thousands of dollars for a calving-ease bull who turns out not to be a calving-ease bull. The genomic testing puts more data and information behind that decision, and so we can have more confidence and take less risk of buying that calving-ease bull who turns out not to be a calving-ease bull. For me, as somebody who's trying to invest thousands of dollars in a cleanup bull or in a herd bull, I want that added assurance of the DNA information, of the DNA data. Okay, so I'm going to briefly go through some data that we have at the Thompson Research Center herd. There at that herd, they've retained ownership of all of their steers when they sell them, and so they've been quite profitable. And they have DNA tested every female in that Thompson herd. So here is GeneMax Advantage scores, that index score for about 88 heifers born in 2014. And so within this very good Thompson Research herd, we have heifers that are in the top 96% of the Angus breed for overall genetic merit for profit. And we've got heifers that are down here at the 43rd percentile, right? So we go from the 99th, we go from a grade of 96 all the way down to a grade of 43, okay? The average of these heifers is about a 78. So let's say we're going to keep the top 60% of these heifers, okay? So we're going to keep that top 60% that's above this red line here. So these are the heifers we're going to keep. And so now we've changed that average from a 78 up to an 86, okay? And so our bottom previously was a 43, now it's up to a 79. And what this means is that by each percentage point of this index, Zoetis says is worth about $1.50, okay? So by changing this average, we've increased the profitability per calf to about $12.50. If you multiply that out by 5 or 6 calves, we're saying that these selected group of heifers are going to be $63 more profitable over their lifetime. One of the nice things we have at the Thompson Research Center is we've got performance data for years and years, okay? And so if we look at birth weight, it's decreasing slightly over time. Birth weight's not important. Don't ever make a selection decision on birth weight. Birth weight's just an indicator of calving ease, but what this is saying is that the birth weight's decreasing, the calving ease is improving in this herd. Some of you might see reports in popular press that we don't see weaning weights improving in commercial herds. In the Thompson Research Center herd, where we've been using AI sires and using EPDs to make our selection decisions, we're seeing weaning weight improve over time. And it's improving by about 1.5 pounds per year. So between 2010 and 2011, that 1.5 pounds isn't a huge deal. But if you stack up that 1.5 pounds over 20 years, now it starts to be a bigger deal for our bottom line. The things that are, in terms of retained ownership, the things that are probably more important for their profitability is their marbling is increasing and their carcass weight is increasing by over 4 pounds per year. So the performance of this herd is improving for multiple different traits over time. When we look at the DNA test results, it matches that phenotypic performance. So the phenotypes are improving over time. These genomic test results are improving over time. If we look at a 2001 born cow to a 2014 born cow. They're increasing by about 4 percentile points per year. Based on Zoetis' number, we would predict that these 2014 born females are going to be $82 more profitable per calf than those 2001 born cows. Okay, so this genomics is matching up with the phenotypic change we're seeing in this herd. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Show Me Select program. One of the things that I identified when I started with Mizzou is that the producers in that Show Me Select program were receptive to change. They were receptive to adopting new technologies. So we started a new program called a Show Me Plus heifer. A Show Me Plus heifer is simply a heifer with a genomic prediction. So if that heifer is registered, she's got genomic enhanced EPDs. If she's a commercial heifer, she's got one of those commercial genomic heifer tests that we talked about earlier. So one of the things that we did is I went and looked at the sales data and I compared the genomic tested heifers to those heifers that didn't have a genomic test. And if we look at that, we see about a $60 to $460 premium for those heifers with a genomic test, right? So in the Show Me Select program, we see premiums if a heifer is carrying an AI pregnancy. So compare a Show Me Plus heifer who was a Tier 1 heifer. If she had genomics, that added about $340 to her price. If we didn't know anything about her sire, she was carrying a natural service, it added about $460 to her price. Part of the problem with this is those heifers that are genomically tested are probably going to be from those producers that tend to have the better calves and have that reputation. So we did a statistical analysis where we accounted for the reputation of the consignor. And so before we were seeing numbers of about $400, $300. When we account for that reputation of the consignor, we see about a $200 premium for those heifers carrying a genomic prediction. And based on the price that we pay to have that heifer DNA tested, we see about a 300 to 700% return on that investment. Okay, and this has held true. The Show Me Select sales that we've had this fall, where we've had Show Me Plus heifers that have genomic tests, those Show Me Plus heifers have topped the sales this fall. If you are going to pay for a DNA test, you have to identify how you're going to receive a return on that investment, okay? So maybe that's just trying to make better selection decisions and select more profitable cows. But you have to use that information in some way. So if you just DNA test a set of 10 heifers and you keep all of those 10 heifers, you have not used that DNA information in any way to make a decision. So if you're going to keep 10 heifers, what you really need to do is test 20 or 30 heifers. And based on the DNA results of those 30 heifers, you select the 10 that you're going to keep. Okay? You're still going to do the phenotypic selection that you do for good structure and good feet and those type of things, but you want to add to it making selection decisions based on the DNA test results. The other really interesting thing to me is if we go and we test a set of heifers, the average genetic merit of that set of heifers is going to equal their steer mates. And so when you test those heifers, now you've got a marketing tool that tells buyers the genetic potential of those steers. Okay? And so there's a couple of different programs, Top Dollar Angus, Reputation Feeder Cattle, that you DNA test those heifers and use those test results to market the steers. And so that's a way that you're not retaining ownership, but you're marketing your cattle differently to see that return on investment in genomics. The other really easy way to see return on investment in genomics is if you're retaining ownership. If you're already retaining ownership, adding DNA testing is probably going to help, right? Because right now, when you're making those heifer selection decisions, carcass weight, marbling, yield grade, those things aren't going into your heifer selection decisions. By doing the DNA testing, you can add those other traits into your selection decisions. Okay, going to change gears for a little bit and talk to you all about a grant that we have funded. And the purpose of this grant is to look for local genetic adaptation. It's looking for cattle that are matched to their production environment. And so what we do is we take precipitation data, temperature data, and elevation data, we combine it together and we split up the United States into 9 different regions. And so we're going to compare cattle across these regions to look for genetic differences that lead to adaptation to these environments. So, if an animal is well adapted to an environment, it's going to be productive, it's going to produce well, and we're more likely to keep it as a replacement and to keep its daughters as a replacement female. But if an animal is not adapted to a region, it's going to underperform, and we're going to call it from the herd, and we're not going to keep any of its progeny. Okay? So what this means is that when we see these performance differences due to genetic adaptation, that's going to change the frequency of those DNA variants that are responsible for that local adaptation. And so we're going to look at the DNA of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of cattle across the U.S. to look for signatures of that selection that's due to that regional adaptation. So we won't be measuring any traits, but that selection will be indicative of selection for various environmental stresses: heat, cold, altitude, perhaps fescue, toxicosis, those type of things. And so we're using the history of cattle across the U.S. to better understand the selection that has happened and this local adaptation. The ultimate deliverable from this grant will be region-specific genomic enhanced EPDs and indexes. And so let's take these 2 bulls, bull A and bull B, and if we look at them in one environment, bull A ranks ahead of bull B. Okay, bull A is worth $52, bull B is worth $42. There's a $10 difference in profitability between these 2 bulls in environment 1. But if we analyze the data from environment 2, now we see that bull B is $3 more profitable. So we've seen re-ranking between these different regions due to these gene by environment interactions. The other thing that we're going to do in this grant is we've recruited about 8,000 cattle that we're going to get hair shedding scores on. Hair shedding has been predictive of how that cow deals with heat stress, and those cows that slick off earlier in the summer tend to wean a heavier calf. Okay, so we've got these scores of a 5. In May or June, she still has her complete winter coat. A score of a 3 is she shed off about half of her winter coat, and a score of 1 is she's shed off all of her winter coat. If you get on my blog, A Stake in Genomics, you can find more information about this project and this grant. Last point that I'll make to you all: most of us have one of these smartphones or a cell phone of some kind, right? Who wants to come up here and take a turn being the presenter and explain to all of us how our cell phones work? You want to come up and explain? I have no clue how a cell phone works. I have no clue how the signal goes from my phone to some tower to somebody else's phone. But this is what I do know. It works. I don't know how, but I know it does work. Okay? All of the things that we've talked about today, EPDs, selection indexes, genomics, you all don't need to know how they work. What you all need to know is that they do work. Okay? So the next time when you go to a bull sale, don't look at the actual birth weight to pick a bull. Use those Calving Ease Direct EPDs, trust the technology, use it, and look at those indexes to make the right decisions. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. I think we've got about 8 minutes.
So you're telling me, like on the commercial heifer side, I got Bromby Angus cross cows. Is that genomic? Well, my testing since Bromby hasn't got a whole lot of database, was that not probably going to do me any good, is it?
Probably not. So if you've got some of those, if you've got females that three of their 4 grandparents are Angus, so they're 3/4 Angus, 1/4 Bromby, those Angus tests will probably work. If you've got a straight 50 Angus, 50 Bromby, right now there's not a genomic test available.
We're going to have to wind it down.
Oh, okay.
Partly because we've got to get the next one loaded, and partly because our technology person's here. We're going to try to figure that out. If y'all didn't get one of these evaluations, please let me know.